Well, hello again and happy springtime to you, my Rouse's Point Rodins. My mini Michelangelo is my teeny Berninis. Now, the reason I mention Rodin, Michelangelo, and Bernini is because they are three of the greatest sculptors in history. Check it out. I told you, pretty impressive, huh? But I have a feeling, a big feeling, that the next great sculptor is going to come from right here in Rouse's Point Elementary. And why do I think that? Because you have something that none of them had. You've got sculpting. Imagine what Michelangelo could have done if he had sculpted clay. And I thought it would be fun if we worked on something together. I kind of like to feel a part of things. So we're going to work on something together. And since we are the Rouse's Point Cougars, we're going to make, you guessed it, warthogs. No, we're not going to make warthogs. We're going to make cougars. And if you're ready, and even if you're not ready, we'll get started now. Now to get started, I want to pinch off a piece of clay that's going to be big enough that I can make two spheres or two balls of clay that are about the same size. One of them is going to be about as big as a golf ball, and the other one is going to be slightly smaller. And it takes a little bit of trial and error, but I'm going to start with this one right here, and I want it to be, when I form it, to be about the size of a golf ball. And I'm going to take off my wedding ring, and if any of you are wearing wedding rings, it might be a good idea to take yours off so you don't get it covered with clay, but make sure you keep it close by. And I'm just going to shape my clay until it's nice and smooth and about the size of a golf ball. And that's one piece. The other piece should be slightly smaller. How much smaller? Well, just smaller enough so that when you look at the two of them, you can tell a difference, but not much more than that. Like I said, one is about the size of a golf ball and the other one is just a little bit smaller. Now, when you've done that, you've made your cougar's head and his body. Well, for now, I'm going to work on the larger ball of clay, and I want to change the shape from a circle or a ball to more like an egg. So I can do it one of two ways. I can either work in my hand like this, where I just pinch the bottom of the clay a little bit more. You can see my hands are open. If I go like this, it's just going to get long and skinny, but I want it to come to a bit of a point. So if you look at my hands, they're close together at the bottom and open at the top. So when I go like this, that clay gets smaller on the bottom like this. You can see how it's shaped kind of like an egg. Another way to do it, if that doesn't work for you, is you can just roll on the table, and when I roll it, I'm pressing down on this part, but not on this part. This part stays the same size, but if I press down on one end, it gets smaller. Now I want it to be a little bit longer and skinnier than an egg. And unlike an egg, I want it to be flat on the top. So once I've got the basic shape that I want, which is like this, I'm going to take the top and flatten it just a little bit. You can see how it's flat on top now. And now I'm going to just take my thumb and one finger, and I'm just going to pinch it a little bit more to make a flat surface like that. Now this next step isn't absolutely necessary, but you may want to stick a toothpick. Maybe you don't need the whole toothpick. I'll break off a little bit of the toothpick. So that's maybe a little bit more than half. And I'm going to use it as sort of like a little skeleton for my clay project. Now, the smaller piece of clay fits right on top of that egg shape, and now I have my cougar's head and his body. It's important when you attach two pieces together to take a clay tool, or maybe just your finger, and push the clay back and forth where the seam is to make that seam disappear. Because for one thing, you want to make it look like it's all one piece of clay. And also, you want to make it so that when the clay is baked, it doesn't fall apart. When you just stick pieces together but you don't blend them on, sometimes they fall apart when the clay gets a little bit dry or when you bake it. So now if you look closer, you can see that the seam, the line that separates the two pieces of clay, is gone. Now for the legs, I'm just going to get two pieces of clay that are about the size of my thumb, maybe about 1.5 inches long. And I'm just going to roll it on the table, and I'll do a little trial and error. This looks like it's about right. Like I said, if you look at it compared to the size of my hand, it's about as thick as my finger, so maybe it's about as thick as your thumb, because your hand's maybe a little bit smaller than mine. It's flat on both ends, and it's maybe a little over 1 inch long. You can see how it's flat on both ends, but it's round, sort of like a tiny little soda can. And once I have the size that I want, I'm just going to attach it right to the very bottom of my cougar's body. Now again, if you want to, you can use a toothpick to serve as sort of like a little skeleton. Sometimes that helps the pieces stay together. But what's even more important is after you have the piece attached, is that you take your clay tool and you gently push the clay from one piece onto the other piece. You don't need very much, just a little bit of clay, just to get rid of the seam between the two pieces. Well, if I made one leg, it shouldn't be too much trouble to make the other leg. Just do a little trial and error. Roll it up into a ball. And roll it on the table or in your hand until it looks like it's just about the same size as the first leg that you made. Now, when I've worked with students in the past, on this step right here, very often they put the two legs too far apart. They should be just about touching, but they should form a V. So now it's time for his arm. It's going to take maybe a little bit less clay, and his arm is going to be even easier to make because you don't have to have the ends flattened. If you look closer, you can see how it's round on both ends. It's maybe about as long as the leg and maybe a little bit skinnier. And when I attach the arm, I want to make it so that the shoulder is right up at the top of the body. A lot of times artists want to put the arm down here like it comes out of the middle of the body, but it should be all the way up here. Once it's in a position that looks pretty good to you, go ahead and blend the two pieces together, at least up around the shoulder. All I'm doing is I'm taking my clay tool and my thumb, if my thumb is small enough to get in there, and I'm just getting rid of the seam right at the shoulder. But if you look, you can still see the separate line where the rest of the arm is. It looks like his arm is not attached to his body until you get up to the shoulder. Well, now that he has 2 arms and 2 legs, I'm going to give him 2 feet. And the way that I do that is to take 2 pieces of clay that are about the same size, roll them up into little tubes, make the ends a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to place it right on top of the leg all the way at the end. So that it looks like he has 2 feet that are pointing up. And if it doesn't look like feet right now, hopefully it will once I blend it into the rest of his leg. So using either my clay tool or my finger, I'm going to try to blend it in so it looks like now his foot and his leg are all one piece of clay. Well, now that his arms are attached, it's time to start working on his face. And I'm going to take 3 small pieces of clay that are all about the same size, and I'm going to make 3 spheres, maybe about the size of a pea. You can see how tiny they are. 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to put them right in the middle of his face. 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to push them in just a little bit. And you can see how the 2 snowballs on the top are about halfway down the face, and then there's 1 right on the bottom. Well, if the clay is soft, they're probably going to stick on there. But just to make sure that they stay on there, I'm going to press a little bit of the clay onto the rest of the face. After I've done that, I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to push in gently a little bit at a time right above the muzzle. And I want to be careful that I don't squish his head too much, but I'm just pushing it in a little bit to create his eye sockets. You can see how the eyes go in just a little bit, and that's where I'm going to put the eyes. Now to sculpt his eyes, I just need 2 tiny pieces of clay. We don't need to give big bug eyes on our cougar. So you can see how these pieces of clay are very, very tiny. They may look too tiny, but when I press them in and flatten them out, they should be big enough. But you can see how tiny they are initially. And I'm going to put them in right at the bottom of the eye socket. And I'm going to press them in so that they're pretty flat. But you can still see how they're separate from the rest of the clay. And for this part of the clay, I don't think I need to use my toothpick at all. I think they'll stay in place pretty well. Now finally, to complete his face, I'm going to take another small piece of clay, maybe about the size of his eye, maybe a little bit bigger. Here it is. And I'm going to place it right between the top 2 circles on his face, and that's going to make his actual nose. That's going to rest right on top of his muzzle. Finally, to complete his face, or his head, I'm going to take 2 more small pieces of clay, about the size of the clay that I used for his muzzle. They're about this big, but I need 2 of them this time instead of 3. And I'm going to flatten them out so that they look kind of like hockey pucks. I'm not going to flatten them too much. I'm not going to flatten them like a coin, but more like a hockey puck. You can see how there's still some thickness there. And when I do, I'll put both of them right on top. Just like that. And you guessed it, like I did before, I'm going to take my clay tool, and without really changing the shape of the ears, I just want to push just enough clay so that those seams disappear. And if you look close, you can see how the ear looks like it's actually the same piece of clay as the rest of the head. That's what you want. That's the way that you make sure that the ears don't fall off. Now the last step for his face is optional. What I do is I pinch just a little bit of his cheek to a point. I'll try to turn it this way, you can see what I'm doing. This is optional because it's a little bit tricky, and you have to be patient, do a little bit at a time. But if I take some of his cheek and I pinch it to a little bit of a point, not a lot, but just a little bit, it gives it a little bit more of a feline or cat-like look. I'm pinching it to just a little bit of a point. And after I've done one side, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Well, now that I've finished my cougar's face, I'm going to give him little thumbs. And all I have to do is to take 2 little pieces of clay, roll it up into little tubes, and then place it right so the end of the tube is right at the end of his arm. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's right there. And I want to make it look like it's attached to his arm, so I'm going to take my finger and blend a little bit, but I don't want to blend the whole thing because I want to show how the thumb is separate and it's only attached at the very top. And now he's got a little thumb at the end of his hand. Of course, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now he has 2 little thumbs. I'm going to work on the bottom of his feet, and we are almost finished. I'm going to take a very small amount of clay, and I'll put it right on the bottom of his foot and press down. I want it to be very flat, but I also want it to look separate from the rest of the clay because this is the little pad, the little pink pad on the bottom of his feet. After I've done 1, I'm going to do 3 or 4. I always do 4. But these are very, very tiny pieces. You can see just how tiny they are. And I'm putting them right above the big circle that I placed on first. And there are now my cougar has the bottom on both of his feet, and the only thing that my cougar absolutely has to have now is a tail. So I'm going to break off a little piece of clay. I'm going to roll it into a little tube, like a little worm or a little snake, that's maybe about as thick as my clay tool here, maybe slightly thicker, but not quite as long. Once I've rolled it out, I'm going to attach it right to the very bottom of my cougar, not in the middle of his back, but right at the very bottom. And of course, like I said before, I'm going to take either my finger or my clay tool and blend it on where it's attached to his body so it looks like it's all one piece of clay. Now, my advice would be not to leave the tail loose like this because it's very likely to break off. What I would do is press it right up against his back. That way it still looks like a long tail, but because it's up against his back, it's much less likely to break off. And our cougar is now finished, unless you want to add clothes to your cougar, and that's completely up to you. If you do, all you have to do is take your toothpick and draw a line wherever you think the clothing that he's wearing should end. So I drew a little line with my toothpick right along the middle of his arm, and that shows his sleeve. Now you can decide for yourself if you want your cougar to be wearing a jersey or any clothes, a pair of shorts, whatever it is that you want to be wearing. And after I've drawn my line, I'm taking my clay and I'm pushing a little bit of the clay from his arm up to that line, and then I'm stopping. And when I do that, it makes it look like the jersey is a little bit thicker than his arm. I can do the same thing around his neck, around his other arm, and then of course the bottom of the shirt. I just have to draw a line going across the bottom of his belly and all the way around to his back. If you want to, you can also draw a line right here if you want to give your cougar shorts, but that's completely up to you. Well, now my cougar is completely finished and ready for the oven so that I can bake him and make him permanent so he's ready to be painted. And we'll talk more about painting him in our next video, but for now, stay creative, stay safe, stay cougar strong. We'll see you soon.